At exactly 8:05:42 a.m. local time, two precision-guided munitions struck a rural military outpost in Burkina Faso's Yatenga province. The attack was surgical, direct, and fatal. 3 were killed, 2 soldiers and 1 civilian. A key communications relay was destroyed, severing links between forward units and central command. The strike came without warning. No notice, no consultation. The order came from the United States. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense confirmed what many feared. This was not part of any joint operation. It was a unilateral military action carried out by U.S. Africa Command assets based over 600 kilometers away. According to international law and Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, it was an act of aggression against a sovereign state. For too long, Africa has been told these partnerships serve security. But on that morning, the message was clear. Sovereignty can be ignored when inconvenient. President Ibrahim Traoré, a former artillery officer turned head of state, responded within hours. He stood before a nation already reeling and said, calmly but firmly, "This strike was not merely against our land. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people." Within the next 12 hours, his words would travel far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In military terms, this was a strike. But politically and historically, it was a spark. So we ask, was this a miscalculation by a global superpower? Or was it something far more deliberate? Was it a message? And if so, Africa is now writing its reply. If you believe sovereignty is sacred, if you believe power must answer to principle, stay with us. Because this story is only just beginning. The first missile struck a reinforced barracks just outside the village of Wahia in Burkina Faso's Yatenga province. Seconds later, the second impacted a relay tower positioned on a nearby hillside, one that linked several forward operating posts across the northern security corridor. Both targets were hit with precision. Both were completely destroyed. The local time was 5:42 hours. Casualties were confirmed. 2 Burkinabe soldiers killed instantly, 1 civilian, a 19-year-old communications technician, died from shrapnel wounds en route to the hospital. 7 others were injured. Several required amputations. The tower collapse also severed real-time coordination between security forces in the volatile northern provinces, leaving entire regions momentarily cut off. Official reports later confirmed the origin of the strike, a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper drone, operating from a forward base in Niger. The aircraft had not filed coordination protocols with Burkina Faso's air defense network. No warning was given. No regional security alert was issued. It was a clean execution, by military standards, but a political detonation. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense moved quickly. Within 2 hours of the attack, press briefings were held. Maps were shown. Impact zones were verified. The tone was calm, but unflinching. This was not part of any joint operation. This was a foreign strike on Burkinabe soil. We will respond, politically, diplomatically, and militarily. To the international audience, that sounded like posturing. But to the people of Burkina Faso, especially those who lived near Wahia, it was war made personal. Umar Diallo, a 58-year-old retired sergeant who now runs a grain co-op just 12 kilometers from the blast site, described the moment it happened. The sound, it wasn't just loud, it had weight. My windows shook. My wife screamed. My grandson fell off his chair. When we heard later it was an American drone, I just sat down. I didn't know what to feel. Sadness, maybe? But mostly disbelief. Diallo's story is not unique. Across the region, civilians tuned into the radio, trying to make sense of what had happened and why. Many had spent years believing the U.S. military presence in the Sahel was there to fight terrorism, not conduct secretive strikes without warning. What made the incident even more volatile was that there was no immediate explanation from Washington. Hours passed with silence. In the absence of facts, anger grew. By noon, rumors began circulating on social media. Some claimed the strike targeted a rebel group. Others accused Burkina Faso's own leadership of withholding intelligence. But one fact was indisputable. An attack had occurred without consent, and it had claimed Burkinabe lives. President Ibrahim Traoré returned to the capital by midday. At 1500 hours, a national broadcast was announced. The country came to a halt. For many Burkinabe, this wasn't just another political moment. It was a test of leadership. And Traoré delivered. Wearing his standard-issue camouflage and speaking without a teleprompter, he addressed the nation with a tone more military than political. "We are not victims," he said. "We are a sovereign people, and no sovereign nation tolerates foreign missiles over its skies without cause or consultation." He then ordered Burkina Faso's armed forces to high alert. 12,000 troops activated, 1,200 redeployed to reinforce the Mali and Niger borders. Strategic sites including the Ouagadougou Air Base and Koudougou Garrison elevated to DEFCON 2 readiness. Defense ministers scheduled meetings with allied African nations. National security briefings were delivered on state TV every 3 hours. The message was clear. This was not going to be quietly absorbed. But as night fell over Ouagadougou, another kind of movement began. Not in military bases, but in the streets. What began as a strike on a remote communications tower had become the ignition point for something far larger and far more unpredictable. By 1900 hours, the streets of Ouagadougou no longer belonged to vehicles or patrols. They belonged to the people. An estimated 35,000 citizens gathered in Revolution Square, wrapped in flags, waving hand-painted signs, and chanting in unison, "Our land, our right, our future." The air carried the rhythm of djembe drums and the fire of defiance. Children stood on their parents' shoulders. Elders led prayers. Former soldiers in uniform stood silently at the edge of the crowd, eyes fixed on the national flag now flying at half-staff. There were no clashes, no chaos, but the message was unmistakable. This was not a protest. It was a declaration. Across Burkina Faso, images of the rally were broadcast live. Farmers in rural villages tuned in on dusty battery-powered radios. Markets paused. In mosques and churches, pastors and imams urged peace, but not silence. Then came the wave. Within hours, social media across West Africa was saturated with the same three-word chant: "Our land, our right, our future." In Dakar, Accra, and Bamako, it trended simultaneously. By midnight, African news channels had interrupted regular programming. Panel discussions formed in studios featuring political scientists, ex-military commanders, and Pan-African historians. The central question: was this strike meant to intimidate, and did it just backfire? In Addis Ababa, the African Union called an emergency session, the fastest in AU history. Within 18 hours of the strike, 42 foreign ministers from across the continent had joined a virtual summit. Even nations typically aligned with U.S. policy, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, expressed deep concern. Mali and Guinea, led by military governments like Burkina Faso, issued full-throated condemnations. But no moment resonated more than when President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the African Union directly. His face appeared on a giant screen inside the AU's central chamber. He spoke without notes, his voice deliberate, almost cold. "If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, then none of us are safe. Burkina Faso will not stand alone, and I believe neither will you." The room fell silent. Back in the streets of Bamako, a new kind of diplomacy unfolded. Tens of thousands marched, not under their national flag, but under Burkina Faso's. In Guinea's capital, a candlelight vigil formed outside the Burkinabe embassy. In Nairobi, small but vocal student-led protests called for Pan-African unity and the immediate audit of foreign military agreements. It had begun. Across the continent, the narrative shifted. Ibrahim Traoré, once viewed by many as a bold but isolated military ruler, was now seen as something far more dangerous to the status quo. A symbol, a living contradiction to decades of African leaders who bent under pressure, who compromised sovereignty for funding, who waited for permission to act. Even outside the continent, his name began to surface. In London, New York, and Paris, diaspora communities held spontaneous gatherings. In Harlem, an elder Pan-African activist said, "It took one drone strike to wake up a generation." In Paris, over 500 protesters, many second-generation African immigrants, gathered at Place de la République. The chant was the same: our land, our right, our future. In Washington, the tone shifted. The Pentagon issued a statement calling the strike a targeted anti-terror operation. A spokesperson cited imminent threats to U.S. assets in the Sahel, but failed to provide names, images, or proof. Journalists pressed for clarity. None came. In the vacuum of information, Traoré's version of the story spread and stuck. A sovereign African nation had been attacked without consent. Its people had not crumbled. They had risen. But behind closed doors, the stakes were rising faster than the slogans. Other African leaders were watching, not just the crowds, but Traoré himself. Would he escalate? Would he fold under pressure? Or would he build something the world hadn't seen before? The next move would define not just a country, but perhaps a continent. In the days following the strike, Burkina Faso's capital city took on a dual identity: half rally ground, half fortress. Military checkpoints dotted every major intersection. Soldiers stood in front of banks, hospitals, and government buildings. The Ouagadougou Air Base, once a joint coordination hub with U.S. advisors, was sealed off. Access was restricted to Burkinabe personnel only. Across the country, over 4,000 additional security forces were deployed. At transportation hubs, passengers were screened more rigorously. In the north, where the strike occurred, local police and gendarmerie conducted neighborhood sweeps, not for terrorists, but to reassure civilians. Yet beyond the show of force, the deeper impact was psychological. In Ouagadougou, near the blast zone, schools shut down for 2 days. Parents kept children home, fearing a second wave of attacks. Market vendors hesitated to open their stalls. At night, radio call-in shows filled with voices, fearful, confused, angry. "How do we know this won't happen again?" one caller asked. "What stops another drone from flying overhead?" It wasn't just the fear of warplanes, it was the vulnerability of being small, of being overlooked. President Traoré's administration understood the stakes. Within 72 hours, a full-scale public outreach campaign was launched. Ministers traveled to affected regions, holding town halls, listening to grievances, explaining government actions. State TV increased programming, nightly updates on defense readiness, food security, and diplomatic negotiations became standard. The Ministry of Trade issued emergency measures to protect imports, especially diesel and grain. Within a week, diesel prices had already jumped by 12%. Northern provinces reported food inflation between 8 and 10%. Supplies moving through Niger and Mali slowed down, either from stricter border protocols or private carriers avoiding sensitive zones. For many Burkinabe, daily life was already hard. Now it teetered. Awa Kabore, a single mother of 3 in Kongusi, told reporters, "I'm used to feeding my kids rice and beans. But this week I had to choose between food and medicine, and I still don't know why the Americans attacked us. No one tells us." Her question echoed across communities, especially in urban centers where civil society organizations held forums demanding transparency. One prominent lawyer in Ouagadougou voiced what many were thinking: "Our sovereignty is sacred, yes, but our government must defend it with truth, not just defiance." What do we really know about the strike? What evidence was shared? What intelligence was used? The pressure mounted, not only from citizens but from within the political class. While Traoré maintained a defiant public stance, behind closed doors, parliament members began requesting classified briefings. Some questioned whether Burkina Faso's military had any prior knowledge of American surveillance operations in the north. Others feared deeper fractures with key international donors. Despite these concerns, public opinion remained squarely behind the president. A poll conducted by the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion showed Traoré's approval rating had surged from 62% before the strike to 78% within a week after. Analysts noted that this spike wasn't just about patriotism. It was about dignity. For the first time in years, many Burkinabe felt their government was standing up, not just reacting. The slogans on the streets weren't just anger. They were pride. Still, officials warned that unity could only be sustained if basic needs were met. The Ministry of Health rushed to stock clinics in the north. NGOs were brought in discreetly to distribute aid under government supervision. Meanwhile, the president's office doubled down on diplomatic messaging, sending envoys to West African neighbors, reaching out to the African Union, and preparing a formal grievance for the United Nations Security Council. The goal was clear: signal control, reinforce sovereignty, and prevent escalation. But thousands of miles away in Washington, the machinery of American foreign policy had started to spin, and not everyone agreed on how to respond. Would the U.S. walk back its actions or double down? And how would Burkina Faso survive if international funding was suddenly turned off? The next chapter would test not only Traoré's resolve, but the resilience of a nation under siege, economically and politically. In Washington, the fallout from the Burkina Faso strike hit faster than expected. Within 24 hours, the Pentagon staged a press conference. A spokesperson framed the incident as a targeted anti-terror operation, claiming the drone strike was based on credible intelligence about an imminent threat to U.S. assets in the Sahel region. But when pressed by journalists for specifics, names, evidence, dates, none were offered. The vagueness raised eyebrows not just among reporters but on Capitol Hill. Within days, the Senate Armed Services Committee demanded a classified briefing. Members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, both Democrat and Republican, expressed concern over the lack of transparency and consultation. Senator Mark Rutledge of Illinois delivered a pointed warning. If we are now carrying out drone strikes in sovereign nations without host consent or congressional oversight, we are not just endangering alliances, we are eroding our own moral ground. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department scrambled to salvage diplomatic standing. Talking points were reworded. Private outreach to Burkina Faso's neighboring governments intensified. But the damage was already global. At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's ambassador called for an Emergency Security Council session. In that 3-hour debate, Russia and China seized the narrative, condemning the strike as neo-colonial aggression. France, still nursing its own wounds from declining influence in the Sahel, chose neutrality, calling for restraint on all sides. Germany and Italy echoed measured concern. Berlin warned that security partnerships cannot survive without trust. Brazil and Malaysia, though far from the Sahel, issued public statements questioning the legality of using force without host nation consent. The real divide, however, emerged in the media. U.S. networks like CNN and Fox News emphasized the terror threat. NPR and The Intercept, by contrast, questioned the operation's legality and strategic wisdom. In Europe, Le Monde and The Guardian ran editorials suggesting the strike could accelerate Africa's pivot away from the West. On African news channels, the tone was unified and unforgiving. Analysts and anchors framed the strike not as an isolated error, but as a symptom of a deeper arrogance. And in quiet rooms, both in Washington and Brussels, a question was quietly gaining traction. Had the West underestimated what Ibrahim Traoré represented? Not just to Burkina Faso, but to a continent long overdue for change? In the days that followed the U.S. strike, a quiet theory began to surface. Not in mainstream headlines, but in think tanks, independent African media, and off-the-record conversations between diplomats. What if the drone strike wasn't about terrorism at all? What if it was about resources? Just weeks before the attack, Burkina Faso had begun reviewing and suspending several foreign mining contracts, particularly in gold and manganese. These actions, publicly justified as protecting national interests, were seen by many Western stakeholders as deeply threatening. Burkina Faso, like much of the Sahel, sits on a rich bedrock of untapped minerals, resources vital not only to regional economies but also to global supply chains. And then came the strike. The outpost that was hit, located near the Tambao corridor, an area believed to contain one of the largest manganese deposits in Africa, and under renewed exploration efforts since Traoré's administration tightened control. To some observers, the timing was no coincidence. A leaked internal report from an African regional economic bloc, never officially acknowledged but widely circulated online, suggested that external commercial interests may have influenced intelligence-sharing pathways linked to military operations. In simpler terms, someone might have used the war on terror as a smokescreen to send a message about mineral control. Add to that a pattern. 3 other countries, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, each of which had reduced Western military presence and moved toward localizing resource control, had experienced military or political pressure in just the past 18 months. Coincidence? Possibly. But the pattern is hard to ignore. For decades, African leaders who challenged foreign economic power were isolated, sanctioned, or worse. But now, with a generation like Traoré's rising, the rules may be changing. And if that change threatens billion-dollar contracts and decades-old influence, what lengths would some be willing to go to stop it? Some stories are too dangerous to be told in daylight. But in Africa today, those stories are beginning to surface, with or without permission. 2 months after the Burkina Faso strike, a similar headline flashed across the wires. A foreign drone, origin unconfirmed, had struck a village in Niger, killing 4 civilians. Within 24 hours, Niger's interim leadership reached out to Ibrahim Traoré. The 2 men stood side by side in Niamey, flanked by their defense ministers, and delivered a joint declaration. The era of foreign strikes in Africa without consultation is over. The statement was more than symbolic. Within days, Mali, Guinea, and Chad echoed the sentiment with matching resolutions. In East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda offered public support. Even in traditionally Western-aligned parliaments like Senegal and Ghana, lawmakers began asking whether hosting foreign bases without strict oversight still made sense. Across tribal, linguistic, and regional lines, something had shifted. For decades, Africa's sovereignty was a phrase repeated in speeches, carved into constitutions, yet often compromised in silence. But now it was being asserted, in public, on paper, with consequences. And Ibrahim Traoré? He didn't start this confrontation, but once it arrived, he didn't flinch. Instead of lashing out recklessly, he fortified his country, stabilized his people, and built a coalition that made retaliation politically costly for any foreign power. From a military outpost in the Sahel, a young African president had confronted history and rewritten the script. But this story is far from over. The next missile could land in another capital. The next decision could spark a larger conflict. The next alliance could redraw the balance of power, not just in Africa, but globally. So we ask, is this the dawn of a new African sovereignty, or the prelude to a far greater storm? If this story stirred something in you, a sense of injustice, a spark of hope, or a deeper curiosity, don't let it pass. Reflect. Speak, and remember this: history belongs to those who claim it. May God bless those who stand for justice, defend their people, and speak truth when silence would be safer.